Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about a deck construction concept that may be helpful for you new players to begin comprehending, and I hope that there's enough good information here that the advanced players are kind of have their interest peaked too. And what I'm talking about are resource curves. Now, a resource curve is one important element to consider when building your deck. And you want to make sure that you're going to be able to pay for everything in your deck in some way or another over the course of the game, or to make sure that you have a good mix and balance of cards at certain resource costs. You never want to include things that are going to be too expensive to put on the board, nor things that are too cheap and not worth the action that it's going to take to play, nor the paper that it was printed on. That said, there's quite a few cards and metagame considerations that can have an impact on how you perceive the resource cost of your deck. And those can range from characters to things about the mulligan, the prevalence of disrupt in the meta, and even just plain old personal preference. So we're going to go over a bunch of those things today to give you an educated perspective on this topic. So let's get started right after the break. Okay, so before we get into all this crazy stuff about resource curves, I wanted to start by just showing you a few different resource curves so that later when we get into the factors that can influence deck construction where the cost is concerned, you'll better understand how these decks can actually function with a variety of curves. Also, this gives me a chance to provide some standard terminology that I might be using throughout this video. So in no way are the terms that I'm presenting here going to necessarily be considered universal in any way, and I'll indicate that to let you know. All right, so with that said, let's take a look at a few different curves from various decks. And the very first curve that I want to talk to you about is the standard curve. And this one is from the Kylo Anakin deck that won the Czech Regionals in 2018. And as you can see from the curve here, it slopes downward very evenly. And a standard curve, one of the properties of a standard curve is that it always has less cards at higher cost on that relatively even slope. So there's less 3 costs, then 2 costs, then 1 cost, then 0 cost. It's pretty easy to understand in general, right? I mean, it looks like you're going downhill, I guess, right? And standard curves are actually becoming less typical in advanced play, but for beginners, they can be really useful in determining if you're going to be able to play each card you draw usually. Generally, these decks with these curves have a higher chance of playing all the cards in their hand each turn because lower cost cards outnumber higher cost cards by some functional margin, right? So these are of course, generalizations, but they're really important to note as they actually impact in-game play quite a bit, right? The next type of curve that I want to talk about is what I personally call the one cost bump. And a deck like my simplified version of General Reekin and Yoda has just such a curve, and it looks like this. And if you look at this curve, it actually looks a lot like a standard curve, but it has a slight bump at the one cost price point for cards in the deck, okay? And decks like this generally have some way to generate a tad more resources in some way. So they can pay for 3 1-cost cards or a 2-cost card and a 1-cost card each turn if they wish to. And 3-cost cards also hit the table with some higher frequency than in other decks. And the reason that this deck can actually afford to pay for more 1-cost stuff is because specifically Yoda is in the deck. And we're going to talk a little bit about Yoda later in this video and what he enables for deck building in general. But aside from the facts that these decks have these particular properties, they're generally rather unremarkable as far as cost curves go. They tend not to impact deck construction too much. Similar to the 1-cost bump is the 2-cost bump, or the Thunderbolt, which I also like to call it. So again, looking at this graph, you can see that it looks a bit like a standard curve with just a slight increase at the 2-cost point on the graph. And this is actually not necessarily attributed to the deck being able to enable additional resource generation like in the 1-cost bump type. Most of the decks in a most of the guns in a deck like Boba Phasma, for example, are just placed at the 2-cost. So you'll see this quite a bit with aggro decks that are running all these 2-cost upgrades like the X8 sniper rifle, the LL30 blaster pistol, the holdout blaster, the hidden blaster, so on and so forth. Essentially, this sort of curve is a game design phenomena because 2 resources is just what the developers decided was a fair cost for these sorts of upgrades that have 2 to 3 damage sides on them, and generally the highest damage is like a pay side, right? There's really not much more to it than that. And decks with this curve actually play mostly the same as decks with a standard curve, with the exception that they tend to tap out their resources each round a bit more than usual. And the problem with that is that when good cost zero mitigation, or when good zero cost mitigation starts to leave the standard format on the villain side, especially, these decks could find themselves in a bit of trouble because they're going to have to choose between that offense and control sort of game right now. And at the moment, they kind of get away with that a little bit because they can afford to just plop down a 2-cost resource and, play something that forces them to give up a die or something else. Yet another classification that I've come up with for cost curves are the flatliners. And these decks usually have between 8 to 10 cards across 0, 1, and 2 resource cost, or 6 to 8 cards that cost between 0 and 3 resources. And the former is actually a bit more common since that fills out your deck a lot better and you don't have to put in, a lot of high cost 3 or 4 stuff. But this curve, it looks almost like a flat line because just about the same amount of cards at each resource cost are actually included in the deck. And a deck you'll actually see that has a cost curve like this most often is the 5-die villain deck. And this deck curve is specifically taken from the Knights of Ren budget 5-die villain deck, which was published on March 1st of 2018. So it's very budget, but the cards that they've substituted in for the higher cost stuff are actually also at the 2 resource cost for the most part, or the 1 resource cost. So they're going to look this curve is going to look very similar to sort of a capped out 5-die villain no matter how you splice it. And the advantages to this are that you always have something that you can play at 1, 2, or 0 cost in your hand for the most part, and you have a lot of options in a deck like this because you're not holding yourself back by saying, oh, I have to be concerned about how I'm spending my money necessarily. But again, like the 2-cost bump stuff, if you play out those 2-cost upgrades, you're going to have to think about where you're going to make up that extra resource in order to use a mitigation card if you don't have any 0-cost mitigation, or how you're going to pay for a pay side on your big old gun there. The last type of curve that I feel is worth noting is what I call the odd or irregular curve. And it can actually have peaks at either the even costs or the odd cost, although the latter is more common in this case. And a deck that actually went undefeated in the Swiss at the Connecticut regionals was Hondo Yoda, and this is the curve for that particular deck list. So typically, when you see a curve like this, it's a lot like those 1-cost bump decks, but you could potentially generate far more resources than just 1 additional one per turn, up to maybe even 3 or even 4 in a lot of cases. And this enables the deck to play a lot more 3 and 4-cost cards than you would be comfortable with playing in a deck that has that doesn't have good characters in it or good event suite that can actually generate additional resources. So when you look at characters like Hondo and Yoda, which we'll talk about later as well, you can get a little crazy in deck building when you're considering big beefy upgrades, because these characters can actually bring a heck of a lot to the table, and they have a huge impact on your resource curve potentially. Okay, so now that you're familiar with some resource curves for decks and what they look like, it's time to start talking about the factors that go into influencing these a bit more specifically. And since the standard curve is sort of the beginner's way to approach Destiny, we want to consider the question, when is it safe to deviate from the standard curve when building my deck? And that's just what we're going to talk about for a few minutes right now. And I call all of the elements that are the answer to that question confounders. And I could just as easily call them deviators, but I kind of like that word better because, we don't always see why adding these elements to decks allows us a greater freedom to modify our cost curve until we put them into practice and observe how they sort of play out. Naturally, excellent deck builders and strategists are going to see those patterns before others, way ahead of others in a lot of cases. And I'm just here to highlight a few of them And from that baseline idea that we're going to talk about today, you can apply the knowledge to your deck building. So the first real confounder is actually not something that you put into a deck. In fact, you already have it available to you because it's actually written into the rules. And it's the replacement rule, which allows you to play an upgrade over another upgrade, discounting its printed cost by the resource cost on the upgrade that we're going to discard. And people almost seem to have forgotten that this rule exists lately for some reason. And it's been that way since it was changed to once per round. I don't know, maybe it's, some move by the player base to try to keep value of the resources you have in play. Honestly, I'm not really sure. But it could also be that one cost upgrades like the DH-17 are better now, are better now than they were in the original block. I'm not really sure, but I think that the DH-17 is still a pretty good weapon. And it's a great example of a gun that basically exists for one round in a lot of cases. But when you look at something like Crystal Ball, people are like, well, I want to keep Crystal Ball around for a while, so I'm not going to use that necessarily as a replacement stepping stone for anything else. So, maybe the newer upgrades are better than the older ones. I don't really know. But that said, in the 2-bump deck and even in the flatliners that we talked about in the last section, one-cost upgrades that can be replaced or overwritten into 2-cost upgrades can have a significant impact on how you build your deck. You can look at each 1-cost upgrade as an investment that you can later replace into a better upgrade. And it also saves you from a disrupt play, and it gives you value for your money in that round by putting a die on the table that can be used now. Remember that unspent money doesn't do anything for you where this particular rule is concerned, right? It's about spending the money so that later on it can be recycled into something better. And using the replacement rule also allows you to keep a resource available for mitigation plays or paying for a pay side later because you didn't spend as many resources in that particular round because you used it. Similarly, you can always consider replacing 2-cost upgrades into 3-cost upgrades. You see this a bit less in a world where a lot of our 2-cost weapons have ambush or redeploy, and they allow us a bit more freedom with our turn sequencing as a result. But anyway, what I want to say is that each upgrade can be viewed as part of the cost to play larger ones, allowing you to shift your resource curve in favor of 1-costers and higher, giving you some liberty to run less 0 cards if you choose, and start considering your curve from the perspective of most things in this deck cost at least 1 resource, and I'm just going to take it from there. All right, this is a really long section, so I'm going to hope that I don't screw this up in one take. So naturally, the characters that you bring to the table also have a direct impact on how you're going to generate resources, okay? So if you bring a battle droid or a death trooper to the table, you'll need to seriously consider your cost curves, capability, as neither of those characters have a resource side on their actual die. Similarly, there are characters whose presence allows us to run away with our cost curve a little bit. And the first character that is worth discussing, of course, is Yoda, right? Yoda has a 33% chance on each of his dice individually to hit a special, and a 56% chance to hit at least 1 special when activating him when he's elite. Now, the special enables the production of an optional resource, which for all intents and purposes is one of the better choices to select each time you resolve his die. And because you can essentially tell yourself, well, I can generate 1 to 2 extra resources per die if Yoda doesn't get mitigated to all hell. So you can actually consider adjusting your cost curve up just slightly to accommodate maybe more 1-cost cards at first. And then perhaps when you add another character like who we're going to talk about next, which is Hondo, you can say, heck, maybe I can even involve additional 2-cost and 3-cost stuff, right? And so where Hondo here is another character who has the potential to generate those additional resources. So on turns where your opponent has tapped out, and again, that's very matchup dependent, you have the same 56% chance at elite to roll a special, which could snag you 1 or even 2 additional resources as the opponent's going to try to pay you off to prevent the 3 damage. Now, the problem with this is that as game goes on, he sort of sees his effectiveness drop a little bit because he's better earlier in the game than later because resource generation becomes cumulative over the course of the game, right? To the point where Hondo can actually be relegated to a non-factor unless he's continuously disrupting your resources with his two disrupt side. So while he's not as great throughout the game or consistent throughout the game as Yoda in generating resources, he definitely has his tricks. And coupled with Yoda, he can really let you run away with resource curves big time. It really comes down to something like turn sequencing, which is the topic that I'm going to be covering in depth at a later date with a friend of mine. And of course, since we've talked about a hero and we've talked about a neutral card, we should probably talk about Thrawn. The big blue man can generate a potential 4 resources per turn at elite on his dice, but the expected value here is probably just 2. But even having 4 resources in a round can really change things. I mean, we're talking, that's a prized possession right there, which is a huge play in a control deck. So yeah, he definitely has an impact on how you can view your resource curve every single round. And notice too for a moment at how popular each of these characters is or was at some time. Yoda is big right now. Hondo, he's made several splashes in the 2018 regional scene. And Thrawn was a dominant force prior to Unkar Plutt's Balance of the Force change in the fall of 2017. And he's still a scary character despite that. You should try him out with Mother Talzin, and you will see what I mean. Also, before we end this section, I want to give honorable mention to the Padawan for being a complete badass at modifying your resource curve. Now, there's also one upgrade that we need to discuss above all, and if you haven't already thought of it, that's Chance Cube. For whatever reason, this card was significantly undervalued when it was spoiled in EAW, and I really have no idea why. Any deck with the ability to turn dice in some way gets maximum value from this die nearly every single turn as long as it is not mitigated. And it's essentially like having a 3 resources for 1 cost die on the table every single round. And it has other applications too, but we're just going to talk about resources today. Imagine what 2 more resources gives you each and every round. It gives you a lot. And if you're still underestimating this card, then you are crazy. Having chance cubes in your deck absolutely lets you include higher cost cards with greater liberty than any other single card in the entire game. And the reason for that is because it's a gray neutral card, so you can play it in literally every single deck, including 5 Jawas, if you're so inclined. There's actually 2 supports that are worth mentioning, which don't make resources necessarily, but save them over the course of the game, and you probably already know what they are. The first one is It Binds All Things, and it's a pretty good card for decks running a heavy blue upgrade suite. It lets you reduce the cost of a blue upgrade once per round, so first round it pays for itself, and thereafter it's saving you $1 every time you use it. It's pretty damn good. Similarly, Tech Team is a neutral red support that works the same way, but for supports rather than blue upgrades. So you can play another Tech Team essentially for free, or plop a vehicle down at a discount, which is actually its intended purpose. So these particular cards let you look at 3 cost vehicles almost as if they're 2 cost vehicles. And 2 cost vehicles as if they're 1 cost vehicles, so on and so forth. So these cards are not to be underestimated because they can have a fairly significant impact on how you perceive the cost curve for your deck. And of course, we have to mention a truly game-breaking card before we move on, which is actually a plot. And I'm talking, of course, about Profitable Connections, which is like the slipperiest slope as far as plots go. And the reason it is so damn good is because the extra resource comes simply at the cost of only using 27 points of characters. It does not require a die resolution or anything else, so it doesn't impact your damage output or whatever else you're trying to achieve in a particular round. Just think for a moment about how great a 3rd resource in round 1 is. You just get it. So bam, you drop a handcrafted light bow, a Captain Phasma's blaster, a Maul's lightsaber. It is so good that it should make your brain hurt, folks. And before we move on, I also want to mention that I'm not going to be going over Battlefield specifically as cost curve modifiers or confounders, because just as a rule of thumb, any battlefield that can generate a resource on claim in some way could potentially contribute to a better resource curve, but you can't guarantee you're going to claim every round. You can't guarantee the choice of your battlefield. But for those that care, you can look at battlefields like Dry Fields, Moisture Farm, and Outer Rim Outpost, which all come to mind. So there you have it. We also need to briefly review how, in general, the colors included in your deck will have an impact on your event choices, because every color deals with resource generation somewhat differently. And what you need to know here is the following. Yellow events generate resources directly with some other effect that usually happens. So cards like Truce, for example, all players gain a resource and you get ambush. While connected just gives you a resource on top of another effect happening. You have to spot a yellow character to do that. Red, on the other hand, functions by increasing your current stockpile by using something in some way. So a card like Logistics allows you to resolve a die showing a resource to get an additional one. And cards like Mobilize essentially says take one more resource for the cost of what you've got going on already, right? So cost 3, it gives you 4, so it's a boost into your economy. That's kind of how red functions. Blue resource generation is very minimal and it encourages the idea of trade-offs. So cards like Enrage lets you deal a damage to a blue character to get a resource, and a card like Adapt lets you sack a shield for a resource. These cards are essentially foils of each other in the game, and they require some kind of input for some kind of output. So there are, of course, exceptions to this outline, but this is generally how the different colors approach resource generation on the regular. Keep in mind that including any of these particular events in your deck, or those like it, will give you a resource burst twice per game, right? Because you can get 2 copies of it. What you choose to do with that extra resource, of course, is up to you. But you can look at it as an investment in, if I get this Enrage in my hand, I can play my Maul Saber on turn 1, something like that. Before I close out this particular section and start talking to you about math, I want to highlight a character who sort of breaks the rules on how we might perceive deck construction where resources are involved. And decks constructed with her could be absolutely considered a one-bump deck, but because resources, as we traditionally perceive it, isn't a primary factor when constructing decks with her, I feel like she's absolutely a special case. And I'm talking about Mother Talzin. Talzin is the sort of ultimate confounder because you have a secondary reason for including additional 1-cost cards in your deck with her, because you want to be able to maximize her activated ability as much as possible to benefit yourself. So essentially, you don't necessarily plan on playing all of these 1-cost cards that you put in your deck necessarily, but the decision to include this card or that card is still based on the utility of that card within the deck itself, right? So decks built around her, like I said, do have an increase in 1-cost cards with them, but because we're not simply considering our ability to play more cards directly, she throws a bit of a wrench in all the things that we've been talking about today. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, there are always exceptions to every rule and every guideline, and Talzin is the exception to basically this entire video. Alright, so I've talked about the mulligan in the past, and I wanted to bring it up here again, because our discussion on resource costs can have a profound impact on our opening hand as well. There are certain decks out in the meta that want to be able to snag upgrades or cards at certain costs in their opening hand so that they can utilize them as quickly as possible. And one deck archetype that actually tries to do this is the Sabine deck type. And Sabine wants to have 2-cost upgrades in her opening hand so that she can play them or discard them and equip them from the discard pile upon activation to gain action advantage over your opponent. And for this reason, I'm going to be taking a look at this Sabine Ezra deck that made top 8 at the Rochester Regional in March 2018. And it's been posted by Scoop Phase on swdestinydb.com. Thanks, dude, for posting your awesome deck list. And I'm going to pop the resource curve in here above the supports, and we're going to break it down. So the first thing you'll notice right away is that this isn't the typical standard curve, nor is it really any of the ones we discussed. It has a peak at 2, and there's even more card cost, even more 3-cost upgrades than 2s, which is kind of weird. And this is due to the amount of confounders that are actually in this deck list, and a few of them that we didn't talk about. So first, we've got Maz's Vault, which allows you to generate an additional resource every single round. It's got 2 copies of Truce in it as well. Ezra is a character here that can be a bit of a confounder because he can steal a resource from the opponent if he rolls a special, and he's elite in this deck, so you're doubling your chance to do that. In addition, we've got the Outer Rim Outpost as a battlefield, which provides a resource and a card on claim, and if you know anything about Sabine decks, they move very, very quickly, so that battlefield actually becomes an incredibly applicable confounder in this deck. Furthermore, the deck has a lot of 0-cost cards in it, so it can actually afford to have a higher cost curve associated with it, between that and all the resources that it's going to make over the course of the game because of the confounders that I just talked about. So a curve like this is the mark of a player who has tweaked this deck significantly and is willing to build a board state that takes advantage of increasingly powerful cards as the game progresses and has the money to actually make all of it happen. But anyway, the targets in the deck are going to be the weapons for Sabine, as that is what drives the power of the deck. And there are 10 total upgrades in this deck, 8 of which are weapons, and 6 of those weapons are actually at the 2-cost landmark. There are actually 7 2-cost cards in the deck, with the additional 7th card being 1 copy of Impersonate. But what we've got is 6 2-cost weapons that we would really like to see in our opening hand. Now, if you remember the video on mulligans, we talked a lot about hypergeometric probability, and we're going to revisit that a little bit here today. And I put all this stuff into the calculator here, and I found that you actually have a 70% chance of drawing at least one of those 6 weapons in our opening 5-card draw. And that's before the mulligan ever actually happens. And since this section is about the importance of a mulligan, I have prepared a table for everyone to have a look at. It is incredibly colorful, and if you want this table, I will send it to you or post it somewhere. And you might remember seeing a table very similar to this when we went over the mulligan way back in October 2017. Well, this table is actually even more advanced than that table. So the column on the left represents the number of cards at any given cost in the deck. So if you're looking at row 3, that means that there are 3 cards at, let's say, 1 cost in the deck. And those are the odds to draw them initially, and the odds across every possible mulligan go from left to right. So in column number 3, in the number of cards for 3, the initial value probability to draw a 1-cost card, if there are 3 of them in your deck, is 43.4% with no mulligan, and it goes all the way to a possible 67.9% or 68% if you'd like to round up. I actually kept everything at 2 decimal points if Excel didn't round it up automatically. So going back to Sabine and her 6-gun example, if we focus just on the row marked 6, which means that there are 6 cards at the same cost which we want to target, we see that the initial 70% draw chance with a hard mulligan can improve our chances of seeing at least one of the 6 guns we want up to 91%. So that is super solid. In fact, 6 or 7 cards at the same cost in a 30-card deck give us amazing odds at drawing at least 1 card in our opening hand, even before the mulligan. So this is how you can look at resource cost as a function of the actual mulligan. For a deck like Sabine, finding those weapons quickly changes your game strategy, but this is not the only deck that can benefit from these sort of analyses. So as you're looking at characters, activated abilities, and other confounding cards even, apply this knowledge as you see fit to construct your decks better. That last section gave me goosebumps. So to wrap things up here, I want to end by talking about the value of Disrupt. And I may have said this in the past, so please excuse me if I sound like a broken record. The Disrupt side on dice is sorely undervalued in this game, both by the vast majority of players and by the game creators at large. With all this talk of how decks can generate resources each turn and burn through high-cost upgrades like crazy, I feel like Disrupt has gotten left behind a bit. And I can understand the reasoning why people don't respect it as much as they should a little bit. And firstly, it's because I feel like there aren't a lot of characters or cards that disrupt a large or mass amount of resources at one time. Secondly, not all of those characters or cards that do exist are considered playable. I mean, when was the last time you saw someone play Diversion in a competitive deck, outside of the recent Hondo, I guess, which is at this point 2 months ago, right? Third, the resource generation in this game has in fact gotten so far out of hand that no amount of Disrupt can keep up with it. So players have kind of given up on it in response, I think. And this last one is what puts the icing on the cake for a lot of players, and it's sad because I feel that that conclusion misses the fundamental point of using Disrupt. No, you're not going to get all the resources every time. You're just supposed to disrupt a resource here, or maybe 2 there, and over the course of the game, that allows you to add some control to the board state. In a sense, it's an aptly named die side, and I'd like to see a lot more of it going forward for the sake of balance. And even if not that, I'd at least like to see people give it a bit more respect. And that's pretty much all I had to say about it. Don't forget that disrupt exists, kids. All right, so we got through this super long video on resource curves and most of the things that I could recall that actually impact them to some degree. This one was supposed to be geared towards beginner players, but I think as I was writing it, I touched upon sort of all levels of gameplay. And I could be wrong, and none of this news is fresh or interesting for advanced players, but who knows? I mean, I just make the video and I hope that you enjoy them. So did you? Post up in the comments either way and let me know. You guys should also know that there is a plethora of video topics in the pipe right now, like a lot. So I'm going to be busy until at least April with all this stuff that I have right now. At least I imagine it like that. And I've got a collaborative video coming soon as well. I'm bringing another content creator who you probably already know to do a video with me on this very channel in this style that I do videos. So hopefully that person will be able to acclimate to what I do here a little bit. I've certainly acclimated to the things that they do, and we have a good time chatting and stuff like that. Unfortunately, scheduling has been a bit difficult with that person since I lost internet for 5 days last week, and we had to cancel that actual video, which we were going to shoot on Friday. Also, I'm going to be on a different content creator show this upcoming Friday, which I'm really looking forward to as well. And once it's posted on YouTube, I will cross-post it on my Facebook, so anyone who follows me and doesn't follow them can be sure to see it. So with all that said, if you guys like what you're watching and you want to hear more about Star Wars Destiny from my brain into yours, please consider donating to my Patreon. I'm not going to get monetized by YouTube anytime soon, and it really does take a lot of hours to put together an episode like this and piece together all the elements and stuff like that. So if you like me, toss me a buck or $5 or whatever. I will be forever in your debt, and truly would be just the most humbling thing in the world. Every time I get a Patreon donation, I'm like, oh my God, someone's giving me cash, right? All right, folks. So I'm going to be heading out of here. Remember that if you're going to be a scoundrel, be the good kind. Always help grandmas cross the street and give up your seat on the bus for that pregnant lady. She might be carrying the next chosen one. And until next time, may the Force be with you.